Hi everybody, welcome back to class. This week we're going to be discussing how we can apply the analysis skills that we've learned up until this point in the semester in the field of policing. So this class is going to be a little bit different than what we're used to. In previous classes up until this point in the semester, I may have talked a little bit when we were meeting in person, but we've largely been relying on completing workbook exercises. And this is so that you can learn the various skills that you have so that you're able to complete the analyses that you've learned up until this point and the analyses that you're going to learn in the future. However, this week what we're going to do is, or what I'm going to do is lecture for much of the class period. You are going to have an in-class exercise to complete, and I'll explain that to you at the end of this lecture. Also want to remind you that the new format for the class involves a quiz each week, and as I mentioned in previous lectures, this isn't a quiz per se, it's just a way for me to track whether you're actually listening to me. And so I'm going to do that again this week. So I'm going to stop at hopefully 5 points in this lecture, if I remember, because last week I didn't. We only had 3 questions. Hopefully this week we'll have 5. And I'm going to ask you to answer those questions in a Word document and upload it to Blackboard. In terms of what we'll do today, we're going to take a step back, and I just want to briefly go over what you've learned to do so far. The reason I'm going to do this is because I want to point out to you that what we've learned so far isn't the end, right? So you have created a report for your midterm projects, but that's really not where crime analysis should end. So before we get to where we go from the point of having completed an analysis and a report, I want to just take a step back and review what we've learned. Then I want to talk about how crime analysts could potentially influence decision makers. And remember, this really is the goal of crime analysis itself. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to review that crime analysis process that I talked about the first week of the semester. But I'm also going to introduce you to what's referred to as the 3I model. Now, this 3I model relates specifically to policing philosophy called intelligence-led policing, but I like to also discuss it when I teach crime analysis classes, and that's because I think it's a better model for guiding crime analysis. And before I get into exactly how an analyst can play a role and influence decision makers, what I'm going to do is review with you the relevant policing strategies and philosophies and how the skills that you're learning can play a role in successfully implementing these evidence-based policing strategies. So if you've taken my critical issues in American law enforcement class, that class is also part of this certificate program. This is probably going to be a bit of a review for you because I discussed many of these in that class. But in addition to discussing these policing strategies and philosophies, I'm also going to talk a little bit how the analyst can play a role in successfully implementing them. So you will learn some new information here, but given that people take the classes in different sequences, some people have not taken critical issues in American law enforcement yet. So I'm going to go back over these philosophies. But before we do that, what I want to do is share with you guys some of the pictures I received from last week's quiz. So for me, what I think, or for me, what I believe is that the winners of the coronavirus are dogs. Right? So dogs are pretty damn happy right now because their owners are home with them and they're getting all sorts of attention. And that was clear to me because many of you shared pictures of the dogs, or your dogs, and noted that they were the best part of having to stay at home and not go out. So I just picked a few of these pictures. I'll include other pictures in upcoming weeks. But these were the first pups that popped up on the screen. So we've got Bella, who is Jacob's 5-year-old chocolate lab, Max, who's Andrew's Cavalier King Charles, and Caitlin is actually excited because she gets to pick from this extremely adorable litter of puppies in a couple of months. And then finally we've got this adorable picture of Brad's pup, who I didn't get the name, but how cute is this dog? Alright, so who doesn't love a dog? So hopefully this brightens your day a little bit, and will keep you interested in continuing on with this lecture. Alright, so as I mentioned, I wanted to go back over the crime analysis process with you, because I discussed this way back during week 1 or 2. And so the crime analysis process, according to Rachel Boba Santos, is the way in which crime analysis is generally conducted and improved upon over time. And so if you recall, the crime analysis process starts with collecting data. All right, so we've done a bit of exercise in previous weeks where we've collected data. For much of the class, I've been providing you data, but if you recall, in the beginning, what we did was we learned how to enter data in a form in Microsoft Access, and we drew that data from the reports that police officers were filling out. And so you did learn how to collect data. And then what we've done for much of the semester is learn about how we can collate data, how we can organize data. We've learned some pretty basic and general analyses, so we've largely, up until this point, just been focusing on describing data. So these are kind of descriptive analyses, and we'll get into more sophisticated analyses as this course and then the subsequent crime analysis course goes on, but we have learned some basic analyses up until this point. We've talked about how we need to disseminate this information and how we can disseminate this information to police officers and decision makers via reports. And then the last step of the crime analysis process is you're going to get feedback from those who are consuming crime analysis products, so that this process can be started again and hopefully improved upon based on that feedback. All right, so this is the crime analysis process. Any crime analyst who's taken a class has learned about this process. And as I mentioned, I think the crime analysis process is important to learn, but what I prefer to teach my students is what's referred to as the 3I model of intelligence-led policing. So intelligence-led policing is something that we learned about in my critical issues class, if you've taken that before. So if you haven't taken that class, you'll eventually learn about intelligence-led policing in a bit more depth than I'll cover here. But I just want to pull out a particular section of Jerry Ratcliffe's book, which is kind of the Bible on the topic of intelligence-led policing. And in this section of his book, what he's doing is he's kind of critiquing the intelligence cycle, which is similar to the crime analysis process. This is a cycle that intelligence analysts learn in terms of how you go about intelligence work. And one of the things he points out is that models should not be underestimated in policing. Right, so crime analysis process is a model. In a couple weeks we'll learn about the SARA model of problem-oriented policing. And these are pretty important according to Jerry Ratcliffe, because they signal to both a crime analyst and a police officer, and we're talking about officers in general, so this could be line level officers or managerial staff. Models kind of signal the role that each actor is going to play, and this, as I said, includes both the analyst and the officer. And so in a part of his book, what Jerry Ratcliffe talks about is, and I should point out that this is specific to, or his critique here is specific to intelligence-led policing and the intelligence cycle. But what he says is that the intelligence cycle divorces the analyst from the decision-making heart of the law enforcement process. And what he means there is, because there's no actual spot in the intelligence cycle, and as it relates to this class, to the crime analysis process, that gives a crime analyst direction in terms of how they can actually play an active role in framing the strategies that are going to be implemented in the field. This has the potential to signal to both police officers and analysts themselves that that's not their role. Right? It's not their job to actually make suggestions or to provide some guidance based on analyses that are conducted. So as I said, my personal belief is that this criticism can also be levied at the crime analysis process. And so that's why I like to teach the 3I model. So what Ratcliffe says in his book is that the 3I model is a way of conveying to analysts and executives the role that each is going to play within an intelligence-led policing model. So again, although he's speaking specifically to intelligence-led policing, I'm applying this to kind of the broader field of policing and crime analysis. So the 3I model is pretty simple. It starts with an analyst being tasked with interpreting the criminal environment. And so the beginning stages of the crime analysis process are kind of just assumed to be a part of this first step, where we have an analyst who is interpreting the criminal environment. And so really what this first step is doing what we've done so far. So collecting data, collating data, analyzing data, and putting together a report after we interpret the criminal environment. But the 3I model is different from the crime analysis process because the results of that crime analysis product and the knowledge that the analyst is gleaning is meant to influence the thinking of decision makers. Right? So this is key, and this is really important, because if we apply this to crime analysis, what we're saying is the role of the analyst is not over. Right? Their job is not done simply because they've created a report. Further, what they're supposed to do is to convey this information to decision makers and try to influence the strategies and tactics that they implement in the field. And so who might a decision maker be? Right? A decision maker in law enforcement agencies is probably going to be someone who's in a supervisory position, right? Because we know that law enforcement agencies are quasi-military organizations. We've got ranks, so we've got officers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and so forth. And so a decision maker is most likely going to be someone who is of a higher rank. So after the analyst identifies who this decision maker is, provides them with information, and tries to influence their decision making, the next step involves that decision maker actually putting in place strategies that are meant to have an impact on the criminal environment. And so in other words, what we are hoping is that after an analysis is conducted, we're going to have a decision maker that consumes that information and implements strategies that are tailored to the problems that we see in the criminal environment. And hopefully they're going to be implementing strategies that are evidence-based, or in other words, strategies that we know through research, analysis, or experience are capable of actually having an impact on the criminal environment. And so what this suggests is not only do we hope that we have decision makers who have an understanding of what works and what doesn't work in policing, it's also important that the analyst knows this information as well, because under this model we have an analyst who's going to be trying to influence the decision maker. And so that's why in my crime analysis classes I also focus on trying to convey to my students an understanding of what does and does not work in policing. And so, as we know, crime analysis is not just concerned with trying to reduce crime, but that's really what I'm going to be focusing on this week. So there's all sorts of different type of analyses, as we've learned, and some of them don't relate to crime reduction or crime prevention. However, that's what I'm going to be focusing on as we continue on with this particular lecture. So I'm almost to my 15-minute video limit, and so I'm going to pause here and I'm going to pose the first quiz question to you. And that is, what was the best part of this past week for you? And so what's the most positive thing that happened to you in this past week? All right, so what I'm going to do is I will end this video here. In part 2, I'll pick up where we left off here with this 3I model of intelligence-led policing. So I'll see you in video 2.